Keith Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. No, order. I've called Keith Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of the Defence and asks, has New Zealand's SAS detained anyone during its operations or joint operations with other forces since being redeployed to Afghanistan in 2009?
The Honourable Dr Wayne Matt.
Mr. Speaker, on the 30th of January, the New Zealand SAS detained a mid-level Taliban commander in response to a tasking by ISAF. This was because the Afghan authorities, including the CRU, were not available at the time. This person was transferred to a United States facility at Bagram and is now being held at a joint US-Afghan facility at Parwan. The detainee is being monitored by New Zealand officials in accordance with our responsibilities under international law. The last visit to the detainee was by New Zealand officials on the 25th of April. His principal complaint was that he was unhappy at being held by infidels, but had no other concerns. Mr. Speaker, I might note that on these issues, the government relies on the professional competence and honesty of the New Zealand Defence Force and not on the unreliable, disproven allegations of John Stevenson.
This was a very straightforward question. The Minister answered it very well, and we didn't need the last bit. Keith Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On how many other occasions have prisoners been taken, particularly given the fact that at the Select Committee hearing of the Defence Force in June last year, the government said that up to that point, that is 2009-2010, our SAS had been, quote, in the vicinity on 22 occasions when prisoners had been taken.
The Honourable Dr Wayne Matt.
Mr. Speaker, I am advised that people have been arrested by the CRU on 24 occasions when New Zealand has been in dispute. I might note that the CRU is accompanied by a prosecutor from the Afghan Attorney General's office who actually authorises the arrests.
Keith Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the government accept any responsibility for the prisoners taken on joint operations between our SAS and CRU, or are we simply trusting the Afghan government, which has a very bad record of mistreating prisoners in detainment?
The Honourable Dr Wayne Matt.
Mr. Speaker, the Afghan authorities are of course the detaining or arresting authority in those circumstances. However, we do understand that in the past the Afghan government has had some deficiencies. That is why NATO ISAF headquarters in Kabul has a committee to monitor the conditions at the various facilities, including NDS at Kabul. A number of nations, including Australia and Canada, which directly transfer detainees to NDS, monitor those facilities. New Zealand has supplied a defence legal officer to a NATO ISAF headquarters to improve our own monitoring. We are advised that the NATO ISAF headquarters now regards the facility in Kabul as the detention facility of choice and actually directs NATO ISAF nations to use this facility because it is in fact properly monitored.
Keith Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the government make public the text of the agreement between the Afghan and New Zealand governments signed on 12th of August 2009 on the treatment of prisoners? Will it be published either in full or abbreviated form?
The Honourable Dr Wayne Matt.
Mr. Speaker, this question has been asked before in the Select Committee and indeed in this Parliament. The document is being kept confidential at the request of the Afghan authorities. However, I have indicated in the Select Committee that one of the provisions of the document does in fact require the Afghan authorities to observe the norms of international law.
Keith Locke.
Mr. Speaker, what evidence did the government obtain on the subsequent mistreatment of prisoners handed over by the SAS to American jurisdiction after the raid in Band-e-Timur in 2002, and does it square with the evidence journalist John Stevenson obtained from those affected?
The Honourable Dr Wayne Matt.
Mr. Speaker, it is certainly acknowledged that there was mistreatment in 2002. That was complained of at the time by our senior officers present at the time, and then subsequently over the years under the previous government, including in fact the Leader of the Opposition, procedures were improved on part of the New Zealand government in that regard. But essentially that is the responsibility of the United States government. They realise, of course, that the events that occurred back then would not meet appropriate standards.
Keith Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has the government done anything to follow up the welfare of the Afghan civilians who were mistreated and tortured on that occasion, to provide some form of compensation, for example, given it was the SAS that handed them over to mistreat them at that point?
The Honourable Dr. Wayne Mapp.
Mr. Speaker, the mistreating authorities were in fact the United States. Surely the responsibility must in fact lie with the United States, not New Zealand.
Keith Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the government allow an independent inquiry so that the evidence of the hard-won evidence of the journalist John Stevenson and the evidence that the government has can be put to independent examination, and the full facts of whether New Zealand is handing over prisoners to mistreatment or not following them up properly in Afghan detention can be brought out into the public domain?
The Honourable Dr. Wayne Mapp.
Mr. Speaker, can I say this? The NZDF has investigated the allegations by Mr. Stevenson, particularly those relating to 2002. They have been proven to be false, and I'm frankly surprised that Mr. Locke continues to rely on those allegations proven to be false. Can I also say this? On this issue, Mr. Speaker, the national government, and I would like to think other members in this House, believe that the information given to us by the New Zealand Defence Force. I believe Jerry Mataparai and General Jones on this issue.
Point of order? Point of order,
Keith Locke.
I seek leave to table an article by John Stevenson in the May issue of Metro entitled
Order. We don't need to table stuff in recent magazines. Question number 6, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Thank you, Mr.